On a sun-kissed summer morning in 1874, the most wounded souls often find each other when they need it most. In the wild forests of Colorado, a solitary mountain man named Eli stumbled upon a lost girl. She had no family, no memories, and no name. He took her in, intending to bring her to town once winter arrived. But as the months unfolded, something profound shifted between them. She learned to swing an axe and set traps with skillful hands, while he rediscovered the simple joy of a smile. In the heart of the wilderness, they forged a family of their own. Then strangers arrived, armed men with perilous questions. Eli uncovered that the girl's past harbored deadly secrets. What dark truth lay hidden? Would someone kill to keep it buried? Before we dive back into the tale, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story stirs your heart, don't forget to subscribe. For tomorrow I have something truly special waiting for you. The morning sun cast long shadows through the pine trees as Eli Thorne stepped onto the rough porch of his cabin, a steaming cup of coffee cradled in his calloused hands. At 43, he moved with the careful economy of a man who knew survival demanded attention to every detail. His beard, more salt than pepper, framed a face etched by years of isolation and the kind of memories that drove a man to seek the mountain's company over humanity's. His cabin stood in a natural clearing on the eastern slope of what locals called Bear Mountain. Though he'd never spotted a bear in the 3 years he'd lived there, he'd built the structure himself, cutting and fitting each log with the precise method honed in war. The walls were thick enough to ward off Colorado's biting cold, the roof steep to shed heavy snow, and its position allowed him to spot anyone approaching from the valley long before they saw him. That morning felt different, though he couldn't say why. The air held an unusual stillness, the kind that often preceded a shift in weather, fortune, or both. Eli had learned to trust such feelings from his time in the 5th Infantry of Colorado. His old commander, Colonel Morrison, had warned that soldiers who ignored their instincts ended up in shallow graves, and Eli had seen enough of those to last a lifetime. He'd come to this remote spot after the war ended, wondering what a man should do with skills suited only for killing. His discharge papers, tucked in an old tobacco tin under a loose floorboard, told the official story. Honorable service, twice wounded, decorated for bravery at Glorieta Pass. But they didn't capture the dreams that still jolted him awake, or the way his hands trembled when the wind whispered through the trees, echoing distant musket fire. The nearest town, Copper Falls, lay 24 miles down the mountain, connected by what could charitably be called a trail. Eli made the trip once a month for supplies, but otherwise he lived as if the world beyond had ceased to exist. By 1865 he hunted deer and elk for meat, trapped smaller animals for pelts, and tended a garden that sustained him through long winters. It was a simple, quiet life, and most importantly, one where the only person harmed by his presence was himself. The sound came first, a faint cry that might have been a hawk or a coyote pup, but it came from the wrong direction and carried a note that made the hairs on his neck stand on end. Eli set down his coffee and moved to the porch edge, his hand instinctively reaching for the Colt revolver he wore even during morning chores. The cry repeated, closer this time and unmistakably human. He descended the steps and crossed the clearing, following a hunting path that wound through towering pines. The forest floor, soft with decades of fallen needles, muffled his footsteps as he headed toward the sound. He found her in a small meadow, about 400 yards from his cabin, sitting by a fallen log with her back to him. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old, dressed in what had once been a fine blue gown, now torn and stained with dirt and what looked like dried blood. Her dark hair was tangled around her shoulders, and she clutched a small wooden object to her chest. Eli approached slowly, as he would a wounded animal, with careful movements and visible hands. "Hello there, little one," he said softly. She turned at his voice and something tightened in his chest. Her face was smudged with grime and tears, but it was her eyes that stopped him. A hollow vigilance no child should bear, the look of someone who had witnessed horrors that would haunt grown men. "Are you hurt?" he asked, crouching to her level, but keeping his distance. She shook her head, but said nothing. The wooden object in her hands was a carved horse, the kind a loving parent might make for a cherished child. One leg was chipped, and the paint was worn from tiny fingers rubbing it countless times. "Where are your parents?" Another shake of her head, more resolute. "What's your name, dear?" For the first time she met his gaze and her voice was barely a whisper. "I don't remember." Eli, a soldier long enough to recognize trauma, saw the gaps in her memory, gaps that shielded her mind from unbearable truths. He'd seen that look in grown men after brutal battles. "It's all right," he said, sitting on the log beside her, leaving space so she wouldn't feel trapped. Sometimes, remembering isn't the most important thing. Sometimes, staying safe is. She studied his face with those ancient eyes, weighing his words. Finally, she nodded. "Are you hungry?" The nod was immediate and eager. "I've got bacon and eggs back at my cabin, and fresh bread I baked yesterday. How does that sound?" Another nod, this one with a faint smile. Eli rose slowly, extending his hand. "My name's Eli. I live up the hill. You can come with me if you like, and we'll get you fed and cleaned up." She eyed his hand for a long moment, then carefully tucked the wooden horse into her dress pocket and placed her small fingers in his palm. Her hand was cold, despite the warm morning, and so fragile he could feel each delicate bone. The walk back was silent, save for their footsteps and the distant call of a hawk overhead. Eli adjusted his stride to match hers, and when she stumbled on a root, he caught her without a second thought. By the time they reached the clearing, the careful balance of his solitary life had already begun to shift. Inside the cabin, Eli moved about his small kitchen, while the girl sat at his rough table, watching with that same watchful gaze. The interior was spare but tidy. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, flanked by shelves holding practical books on farming, hunting, and animal care, along with a battered copy of Shakespeare's works that had survived the war. A single bedroom lay at the back, and a ladder led to a loft he used for storage. "How do you like your eggs?" he asked, stoking the fire under his cast-iron skillet. "I don't know," she replied, her voice suggesting that, like her name, this too had been lost. "Ah, then scrambled it is," he said. "That's how my mother used to make them." As he cooked, he glanced at his unexpected guest. She sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, the wooden horse now on the table beside her. There was a formality to her posture, as if good manners had endured whatever trauma stole her memories. When the food was ready, Eli served it on his best plates. Nothing fancy, but clean and unchipped. She ate with obvious hunger, but surprising grace, cutting her bacon into precise pieces and chewing thoughtfully. She finished everything and looked hopefully at the skillet when he asked if she wanted more. "What's that?" Eli nodded toward the horse as he served her seconds. She picked it up, turning it in her small hands. "I think someone made it for me. I remember hands carving the wood, but not the face. It's finely done." he said sincerely. The horse showed real craftsmanship, with smooth lines and careful details. Whoever carved it must have cared for you deeply. Her eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away quickly, as if crying were a luxury she couldn't afford. After breakfast, Eli heated water for a bath while she sat by the fire, slowly spinning the horse in her hands. He found some old clothes in his storage chest, a shirt that had belonged to his younger brother and pants that could be tied with a cord, and left them outside the bedroom door while she washed. When she emerged, clean and dressed in the oversized garments, she looked even younger and more fragile, yet somehow more real. The dirt had hidden the essence of her humanity, which now shone through. "Much better," Eli said. "Now we need to figure out what to do with you." Her face went still, and he realized his words might have sounded like a threat. "I mean, we need to find a way to help you," he added quickly. "The right thing might be to take you to Copper Falls, see if anyone knows who you are or where you belong." "Please don't." The words rushed out, the first real emotion she'd shown. "Please, I can't. I don't want to go anywhere else. Can I stay here?" Eli looked at her standing there in his brother's old clothes, clutching her wooden horse, and felt the walls around his heart begin to crack. He told himself it was temporary, just until he found a better solution. But deep down, he suspected otherwise. "All right," he said. "You can stay for now, until we sort things out." The relief on her face was so profound that Eli had to look away. He busied himself with the breakfast dishes, trying to ignore the voice in his head, like his old sergeant major's, warning of complications and responsibilities he wasn't ready for. But when he glanced back at her, safe and warm by the fire, that voice quieted. Maybe some complications were worth it. The rest of that first day passed peacefully. Eli showed her around the cabin and grounds, pointing out the root cellar, the woodshed, and the small barn where he kept his mule and chickens. She listened intently, asking thoughtful questions that revealed a sharp mind behind those watchful eyes. As evening fell, Eli realized he needed to arrange a place for her to sleep. The cabin had only one bed, and though he could take the floor or the barn, he sensed she'd rest easier knowing he was near. "You can have the bed," he said. "I'll make a pallet by the fire." "Can we share?" she asked simply. "I don't take up much space." The innocence in her voice nearly undid him. "That wouldn't be proper, dear. A gentleman doesn't share a bed with a lady, even a little one." She seemed to accept this, though she watched closely as he laid out blankets on the floor. When it was time for bed, she changed into a clean dress and climbed into the bed, still holding her wooden horse. "Eli?" she whispered in the darkness. "Yes? Thank you. You're welcome. And yes, I'll still be here in the morning." She fell silent, and soon her breathing grew deep and steady. In that quiet moment, Eli lay on his pallet, listening to the forest outside, and wondered what the dawn would bring. Eli lay on his makeshift bed, staring into the dying embers of the hearth, and wondering what in the hell he thought he was doing. He'd spent 3 years avoiding this exact kind of complication, and now he had invited it right into his home. But as he listened to the soft sounds of the child sleeping, the first time in years his cabin had held the breath of anyone but his own, he realized he didn't regret it. Not yet, anyway. Outside, the mountain settled into its nightly rhythm. An owl hooted somewhere high in the pines, and the wind whispered through the trees with a sound like distant voices. Eli had always found these sounds comforting, but tonight they seemed to carry a note of warning. Change was coming to Bear Mountain. whether he was ready for it or not. And tomorrow, he would have to start figuring out how to protect not just himself, but the small, nameless girl who had walked out of the wilderness and into his carefully ordered life. The last thing he remembered before sleep took him was the sound of her voice calling his name. The first time in 3 years anyone had said it aloud in his own home. 3 weeks had passed since the girl arrived, and Eli's monthly supply run to Copper Falls could be put off no longer. His flour barrels were nearly empty, and winter was still months away. The girl, who had begun to answer to "little one" when he called her that, had settled into his routine with a surprising ease, but she had never been off the mountain. "I want you to stay close to the cabin while I'm gone," he said, hitching his mule to the small wagon he used for supply runs. "Don't you wander from the clearing. And if anyone comes, anyone at all, you hide in the cellar until I'm back." She nodded solemnly, her hand tightening on the small wooden horse he'd carved for her. In the weeks since her arrival, it had never left her side, and Eli had noticed how her thumb wore smooth grooves into the painted surface during moments of worry. "I'll be back before dark," he promised. "There's bread and preserves on the shelf, and fresh water in the bucket." The journey to Copper Falls took the better part of the morning, winding through dense forest and across 2 creek beds that would be treacherous in the winter. Eli had made this trip dozens of times, but today it felt different. Every mile that stretched between him and the cabin felt like a weight settling on his shoulders. Copper Falls wasn't much of a town. A general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and maybe 20 houses scattered along the banks of Willow Creek. But it was civilization. And after 3 weeks of quiet domesticity, the noise and bustle felt almost overwhelming. Eli tied his mule outside Morrison's general store and stepped onto the wooden boardwalk. The proprietor, James Morrison, no relation to his former colonel, greeted him with the same reserved politeness he'd shown for the past 3 years. Eli wasn't unfriendly, but he wasn't particularly sociable either, and the townsfolk had learned to respect his preference for brief, businesslike interactions. "Morning, Eli. The usual?" "That's right. Flour, coffee, sugar, salt, and maybe some hard candy if you've got it." Morrison raised an eyebrow at the last request. Eli had never bought candy before, but he said nothing as he began to gather the requested items. While the storekeeper worked, Eli became aware of a hushed conversation at the back of the store between 2 women he recognized by sight, but not by name. "It's terrible. Just terrible. A whole family, they say. Sheriff Hartwell thinks it was that gang of outlaws from the south, the Maddox brothers. But why kill the children, too? Seems senseless, even for bandits." Eli tried not to listen, but the women's voices carried in the small space. Mary Chan from the boarding house said a U.S. Marshal came through last week, asking about survivors. "Survivors? I heard they were all killed." "I thought so too. But apparently there might have been a little girl who got away. The marshal was showing a photograph around." Eli's blood ran cold. He forced himself to continue examining a display of tools, but all his senses were now focused on the conversation behind him. "Poor thing. If she's even still alive. It's been weeks and you know what this country is like. The animals, the elements. Hush now. Don't talk like that. Maybe someone found her. Maybe she's safe somewhere." Morrison finished gathering Eli's supplies and began to tally the cost. "Hear about that business up in Leadville?" he asked, making small talk. Eli's mouth was dry. "What business?" "Federal judge and his family. Murdered in their beds, from what I hear." "Judge Carlil, He was the one trying to stamp out all that corruption in the territorial government. Made a lot of enemies. That's a shame, Eli managed to say. Sheriff Hartwell's put up wanted posters about it. Figures some of those outlaws might be headed this way. Morrison lowered his voice. Between you and me, I'd keep an eye on your mountain. Men like that might figure a lone cabin is an easy target. Eli paid for his goods with hands he hoped looked steadier than they felt. As Morrison loaded the items into his wagon, Eli spotted the wanted poster tacked to the store's notice board. The headline read, "Reward $500, Murders of the Judge Carlyle Family." And beneath that, in smaller letters, "Suspects, Maddox Gang, armed and extremely dangerous." But it was the smaller notice below that made his heart stop. Missing, Carolyn Carlyle, age 6, brown hair, brown eyes, last seen wearing a blue dress, believed to be the sole survivor. Any information, contact the U.S. Marshal's office. The description was a perfect match. The blue dress, now hanging clean in his cabin. The brown eyes that held too much knowledge. The age, exactly right. Something wrong, Eli? Morrison asked. Eli realized he was staring at the poster. No, just a terrible business, like you said. He finished loading the wagon and was preparing to leave, but Sheriff Hartwell chose that moment to step out of the saloon across the street. The lawman was a big man who held his office more through political connections than competence, but he had sharp eyes that missed little. "Eli Thorne," the sheriff called out. "Don't see you in town much outside your regular supply runs." "This is my regular supply run," Eli answered evenly. Hartwell crossed the street, his boots thudding on the planks. "Seen anything out of the ordinary up on your mountain lately? Any strangers passing through?" "No strangers," Eli said, which was technically the truth. "Well, you keep your eyes peeled. We've got murderers on the loose, and word is they might be headed this way." The sheriff studied Eli's face. "You hear anything about a missing girl?" Every instinct screamed at Eli to keep his expression neutral. Morrison mentioned something about the Judge Carlyle family. A terrible business. The girl, Caroline, the judge's daughter, she's still not been found. Hartwell's eyes narrowed slightly. Of course, if someone was hiding her, thinking they were doing the right thing, they might not realize they could be interfering with a federal investigation. "I imagine anyone who found a lost child would want to do the right thing by her," Eli said carefully. "Of course they would. But the right thing would be to bring her to the authorities. Let the law sort it out." The sheriff stepped closer. "Funny thing is, we had some men come through here yesterday. Said they were bounty hunters, looking for the Maddox gang. But they seemed mighty interested in that little girl, too." Eli's hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm, but he stopped it. "Bounty hunters?" "3 of them. Hard-looking men. Asked a lot of questions about anyone new in the area. Anyone who might be hiding something." Hartwell's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I told them nobody in these mountains keeps secrets from the law." "Right. Well," Eli said, moving to climb onto his wagon. "These bounty hunters, they said they'll be working the area for a while, checking every cabin, every homestead, to make sure no one is harboring fugitives." The sheriff tipped his hat. "Have a good day, Eli. And remember, if you see anything unusual, you let me know right away." Eli nodded and clucked to his mule, his mind racing. Something about the sheriff's demeanor felt wrong. The way he'd emphasized bounty hunters with a hint of skepticism. The pointed questions about harboring someone. And why would bounty hunters care about a missing girl when their quarry was supposed to be the outlaws who had taken her family? The trip back up the mountain felt endless. Every shadow among the trees could hide watching eyes. Every gust of wind through the pines could mask the sound of approaching hoofbeats. By the time Eli reached his clearing, the sun was low on the horizon, and his nerves were frayed raw. "Little one," he called out, as he pulled up before the cabin. She appeared in the doorway, still clutching the wooden horse, and Eli felt a relief so profound it nearly buckled him. "You're back," she said, and he could hear the worry she was trying to hide. "Promised I'd be." He began to unload the supplies, but his movements were quick and efficient rather than leisurely. "We need to talk." Inside the cabin, with the door barred and the shutters drawn, Eli sat the girl down at his small table. In the lamplight, her resemblance to the description on the poster was unmistakable. "Little one," he said gently, "I think your name might be Caroline." She went very still, the wooden horse frozen in her hands. "Caroline Carlyle," he continued. "Your father was a judge." The horse slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the table. She looked at him as if he had betrayed her, and when she looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I remember," she whispered. "I remember the blood." Eli reached across the table and took her small hands in his own larger ones. "It's all right. You're safe here. They killed Mama and Papa and Thomas, my little brother." The words tumbled out, as if a dam had broken. "I hid under the stairs, and they didn't see me. But I heard them talking. They said they had to find something. Something Papa hid. They said—" Her voice faltered. "What did they say, Caroline?" "They said they would come back for me, that I couldn't tell anyone what I saw." A cold dread settled deep in his bones. "Caroline, the men who hurt your family, what did they look like?" She closed her eyes, concentrating. "One of them, he had a star on his shirt, like the sheriff in town, and the others, they called him Marshall. It wasn't the Maddox gang. It was federal lawmen, corrupt men of the law who had murdered a judge trying to expose their crimes and were now coming back to silence the only witness. "They're not bounty hunters," Eli said, more to himself than to her. "What?" "Nothing, sweetheart. But we have to be very careful now. Some men came to town today asking questions. They might come looking up here." Caroline's face went pale. "Are you going to send me away?" The question hit him like a physical blow. He looked at this small, brave girl who had somehow found her way to his mountain, who ate his food and wore his brother's old, cut-down clothes, and called out his name in the dark, when nightmares woke her. "No," he said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. "I am not sending you away. We're family now, you and me, and family protects its own." The relief in her eyes was so intense it nearly broke his heart. "But we have to be smart," he continued. "If anyone comes here, anyone at all, you hide in the cellar, and you don't come out until I come and get you. Do you understand?" She nodded solemnly. "Good girl." He stood and went to the window, peering out into the darkening forest. Somewhere out there, dangerous men were asking questions and closing in on the truth. The peaceful life he had built on this mountain was about to come to an end. But as he looked back at Caroline, his daughter in every way that mattered, Eli felt something he hadn't experienced since the end of the war, a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. They could run, disappear deeper into the mountains where no one would think to look. But running meant living in constant fear, always looking over their shoulders, and Caroline deserved more than that. No, running wasn't the answer. Eli had been a soldier once, and soldiers didn't run from a fight when innocent lives were on the line. If those corrupt lawmen wanted Carolyn Carlyle, they would have to go through Eli Thorne to get her, and he would make damn sure they regretted the attempt. The morning after Eli's revelation brought a shift in their routine, one that Carolyn seemed to sense without a word being spoken. She woke before the dawn, silent as a shadow, and found Eli already dressed, checking the weapons on the kitchen table. "Are they coming today?" she asked, sitting beside him with the wooden horse in her lap. "I don't know, little one, but we need to be ready." He set down the Colt revolver he'd been cleaning and looked at her, his expression grim. "From now on, things are going to be different. I need to teach you things that can keep you alive." Carolyn nodded with the same grave acceptance she had shown when he'd first told her about her family. Eli was struck by the resilience of children, the way they adapted to new realities that would shatter grown men. "First," he said, his voice low and firm, "if I tell you to run, you run. No questions, no hesitation. You go straight to the cellar and you hide until I come for you." "And if you don't come?" The question was asked with such matter-of-fact calm it nearly stopped his heart. "I'll come," he said with a conviction he didn't entirely feel. "But what if you can't?" Eli studied her face, seeing not the frightened child he expected, but a young girl who understood that life came with no guarantees. She had already lost everything once. She knew it could happen again. "If I can't come for you within a day and a night," he said, choosing his words carefully, "you follow the creek upstream until you reach the old hunter's cabin. You remember me showing you that place?" She nodded. "There are supplies there. Food, blankets, matches. You wait there until it's safe to move on. Then you head north to Fort Collins. Tell them who you are and what happened. Can you remember all that? Follow the creek upstream. Hunter's cabin. Wait. Fort Collins." Her voice was steady, but her knuckles were white where she gripped the wooden horse. "Good girl," he said gently, "but that's only if something happens to me. And it won't." For the rest of that first morning, Eli began to teach Caroline things no 6-year-old should ever need to know. How to move through the woods without a sound. How to find water and shelter. How to tell if meat was spoiled and which berries were safe to eat. She absorbed it all with the intense focus she applied to everything, asking practical questions that showed she understood precisely what was at stake. In the afternoon, they moved to preparations inside the cabin. Eli showed her how to bar the door from the inside and where he kept the extra ammunition. He taught her how to load his old Sharps rifle, though the weapon was far too heavy for her to properly wield. "Why are you teaching me this if I'm supposed to hide?" she asked as they practiced. "Because sometimes," Eli said, his voice a low rumble, "hiding isn't enough. Sometimes you have to know how to fight." That evening, as they sat by the fire eating a simple meal of beans and cornbread, Caroline asked the question he had been dreading. "Tell me about the war." Eli nearly choked on his coffee. "What?" "You were a soldier," she stated, not asked. "I can tell. By the way you move, the way you check corners before you walk into a room. My papa used to talk about the soldiers who came back." She turned the wooden horse over in her small hands. "Will you tell me about it?" Eli stared into the fire, watching the flames dance over the split logs. He hadn't spoken of the war to anyone, not in the 9 years since Appomattox. But something in Caroline's voice, not curiosity but a genuine need to understand, made him reconsider. It was a hard time, he said finally. Men did things they never thought they'd have to do, saw things they wished they could forget. Is that why you came to the mountain? To forget? Partly. He glanced at her, seeing not judgment but compassion in those dark brown eyes. I lost my brother in the war, Tommy. He was younger than me, always laughing, always finding some good in even the worst of it. He died at Glorietta Pass, trying to save a wounded friend. Caroline clutched her wooden horse tighter. I'm sorry. After that, Eli continued, the words feeling strange on his tongue, I didn't see much point in being around people. Seemed like everyone I cared for ended up hurt, and I was tired of hurting. But you saved me. He met her gaze. Maybe you saved me. They sat in a comfortable silence for a time, the crackle of the fire filling the space between them. Finally, Carolyn spoke again. The men who killed my family, they're still looking for me, aren't they? Eli wanted to lie, to offer some false comfort, but this child had seen too much deceit already. Yes, he said. They are. Because I saw them. That's right. And if they find me, they'll kill me too. Eli turned to face her fully. Caroline, listen to me. I've been taking care of myself in dangerous places for a long time. I know how to hide, how to fight, how to keep people safe. I won't let anything happen to you. You promise? I promise. She seemed to accept that, but Eli could see her mind working behind those watchful eyes. After a moment, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper he had never seen before. I found this in my dress pocket the morning you found me, she said, handing it to him. I was too scared to show you before, but now. Eli carefully unfolded the paper. It was a child's drawing, done in pencil on what looked like expensive letterhead. The picture showed a simple house with a large tree beside it. Beneath the tree, a small X was marked in a darker pencil. Do you remember drawing this? He asked. Carolyn shook her head. No, but I think Papa told me to hide something there. In my dreams, I hear his voice saying, remember the tree, Caroline. Remember where we put it. Eli studied the drawing more closely. The house was rendered in the simple style of a child's artwork, yet certain details suggested it might be a real place. The distinctive shape of the tree, the placement of the windows, even what looked like mountains in the background. What, little one? What do you remember? I don't know, but it was important. Important enough for Papa to make me draw this so I wouldn't forget. She looked at the paper in his hands. Do you think that's what those men are really looking for? Not just me, but something my Papa hid? Eli felt the pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. A federal judge investigating corruption, a child who witnessed his murder, and now a clue suggesting the judge may have hidden something. Documents, records, evidence of the very corruption he was fighting against. I think you might be right, he said slowly. Your father was trying to expose bad men doing bad things. Maybe he hid proof of what they were doing, and they killed him for it. Yes! Caroline took the drawing back, folding it neatly and tucking it into her pocket. Then we have to find it. Whatever Papa hid, we have to find it before they do. Eli started to shake his head. The idea of taking a 6-year-old on some kind of treasure hunt through dangerous territory was madness. But before he could voice his objections, Carolyn pressed on. If we find what Papa hid, we can prove what those men did. We can make sure they don't hurt anyone else. The simple logic of it stopped him cold. She was right, of course. Running and hiding would only delay the inevitable. But if they could find whatever proof Judge Carlyle had hidden, they might be able to turn the hunters into the hunted. It would be dangerous, he said. More dangerous than waiting here for them to find us? She had him there. And looking at her now, this small, brave girl who had lost everything but still thought of protecting others, Eli felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't felt since Tommy died. Pride and purpose. Later that night, long after Caroline was asleep, Eli sat at his table and began to write in a leather-bound journal he had started years ago but rarely touched. With a careful hand, he documented everything that had happened since he'd found her, everything she had told him about her family's murder, and everything he suspected about the corrupt officials hunting her. If something happened to him, someone needed to know the truth. But more than that, writing helped him organize his thoughts, to plan their next steps. He had been a soldier once, trained in strategy and tactics. It was time to remember those lessons. The journal felt good in his hands. Solid, permanent, real. Whatever came next, there would be a record. Caroline's story would survive, even if they didn't. Outside, the mountain settled into its nightly silence. But Eli stayed awake long after the fire had burned down to embers. The next day would bring new challenges, new decisions. But tonight, for the first time since the war ended, he felt he had a mission worth fighting for. Protecting Caroline was no longer just about keeping a child safe. It was about justice. It was about making sure that good men like Judge Carlyle had not died in vain. It was about remembering what he had once fought for and finding the strength to fight for it again. The discovery came during Caroline's bath, on their 5th morning together since she had revealed her identity. Eli was outside tending to his mule when he heard her call from the cabin, her voice taut with something he couldn't place. "Eli, can you come here, please?" He found her standing by the wash basin, wrapped in a towel, holding something small and silver in her trembling hands. Her face was pale, but her eyes held a fierce determination that reminded him painfully of his brother Tommy. "I forgot I was wearing this," she said, holding it out to him. "It was under my dress, hidden by the collar." The silver locket was delicate and expensive, the kind of keepsake a loving father might give his daughter for a special birthday. Intricate etchings of flowers and vines covered its surface, catching the morning light that streamed through the window. But it was what lay inside that made Eli's breath catch in his throat. The photograph was tiny but clear, showing a family of 4 posed formally in what looked like a photographer's studio. A distinguished man with kind eyes and a well-kept mustache stood behind a seated woman, whose dark hair and gentle smile were mirrored in the face of the little girl beside her. A boy, perhaps 3 years old, sat on his mother's lap, grinning at the camera with the uninhibited joy of childhood. "That's them," Caroline whispered. "That's my family." He studied the photograph. Judge Carlyle looked every bit the man of principle he was said to be. Someone who would fight corruption not for ambition, but from a genuine belief in justice. The woman, Caroline's mother, had intelligent eyes and a face that suggested both strength and compassion. "They looked like good people," Eli said softly. They were. Caroline's voice was firm, but a tear traced a path down her cheek. "Papa used to read to us every night. Mama taught me how to play the piano. And Thomas—" her voice broke. "Thomas was always getting into trouble, but never bad trouble. Just curious trouble. Eli handed the locket back to her, but she shook her head. Look on the back, she said. He turned it over and found another engraving, but this one was not decorative. Numbers and letters had been scratched into the silver in a tiny, precise hand. RC 1872, 3745N, 105 Pizzo Dolph W, under the angel's wing. Do you know what this means? He asked. Caroline shook her head, but her brow furrowed in concentration. The numbers. Papa taught me about maps. They look like the coordinates he used when he was surveying land disputes. Eli's pulse quickened. Latitude and longitude, a specific location, likely in Colorado given their position, and under the angel's wing. That had to be some kind of landmark or reference. RC, he said, thinking aloud. Robert Carlyle. That was your father's name. And 1872. Maybe the year he hid whatever this is pointing to. Carolyn took the locket back, closing it carefully and fastening the chain around her neck. Its weight seemed to comfort her, a physical link to the family she had lost. We have to find this place, she said, with the same quiet resolve she'd shown when discussing the drawing. Caroline, no. Listen to me. She turned to him, and in that moment, she looked far older than her 6 years. Those men killed my family for something Papa was trying to expose, something he cared about enough to hide proof and leave me clues to find it. If we don't follow them, if we don't finish what he started, then they died for nothing. The logic was undeniable, but the thought of leading her into potentially hostile territory made Eli's stomach clench. Still, she was right about one thing. Staying here and waiting would accomplish nothing but prolonging the inevitable. All right, he said at last. All right. But first, I need to teach you more about keeping yourself safe. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. The days that followed fell into an intense rhythm of preparation and learning. Eli taught Caroline how to ride his mule, Jasper, her initial awkwardness giving way to a steady confidence. He showed her how to read the signs of approaching weather, how to navigate by the sun and stars, and how to move through hostile country without being seen. More importantly, he had begun to treat her as a partner, rather than a child to be protected. They discussed strategy and planning, weighed risks and rewards, and developed contingencies for various scenarios. Caroline absorbed it all with a remarkable focus, asking sharp questions that sometimes caught him off guard. If we're being followed, she said one afternoon, as they practiced moving silently through the woods, wouldn't it be better to know who's following us, instead of just avoiding them? Eli stopped mid-stride. What do you mean? Well, if we know how many there are and what they're planning, we can make better decisions about what to do next. But if we just run without knowing, we might be running into a trap. The tactical thought behind her question impressed him. You're right. Sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted, and sometimes that's exactly what you want. My father used to say, knowledge is more powerful than any weapon. Your father was a smart man. That evening, as they sat by the fire, planning their route to the coordinates on the locket, Caroline asked the question that had been weighing on Ailey's mind ever since they'd committed to this course. What happens after we find what Papa hid? She looked up from the crude map she was drawing. What do you mean? I mean after we expose these bad men and make sure they can't hurt anyone else. What happens to us? To me? The question hit him harder than he'd expected. In the last few weeks, he had grown accustomed to having Caroline in his life, to the sound of her voice in the morning and the warmth of her presence by the fire at night. The thought of losing her, even to well-meaning relatives or government officials who would want to give her a proper home, felt like contemplating another death in the family. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I suppose that depends on what you want." She was silent for a long moment, her thumbs stroking the silver locket absently. "I want to stay with you, but," she said finally, "you're the only family I have left. Honey, you might have relatives somewhere who—" Her voice was firm. "I remember now. Papa used to talk about it sometimes. How Mama was an only child, and their parents had passed on. There's no one else, Eli. Just you and me." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication and hope. Eli thought of the legal complications, the questions that would be asked, the bureaucratic hurdles they would have to face. Then he thought of sending this brave, brilliant little girl to live with strangers. "Then you'll stay with me," he said simply. "We'll do whatever it takes to make it legal and proper." The smile that spread across Caroline's face was the first truly carefree expression he had seen on her since that first morning in the meadow. "Really? You mean it? But first, we have work to do." She nodded eagerly, turning back to the map. "How far are these coordinates?" Ely had been running the distances and travel times in his head as they spoke. "About a 4-day journey, if we push it. But we need to be careful. That area isn't too far from some mining camps, and there are likely to be a lot of people around who might remember seeing us." "What about supplies?" "We'll travel light and live off the land as much as possible. I've got jerky and hardtack that will last, and we can supplement that with what we can hunt or gather." Carolyn studied the map intently, her finger tracing the route they had planned. "When do we leave?" "The day after tomorrow. That gives us time to finish our preparations." A sound from outside cut him off. The distant snap of a twig, too sharp and deliberate to be the wind or some small animal. Ailey raised a hand for silence and moved swiftly to the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. 3 riders were moving slowly through the trees at the edge of the clearing, trying to remain concealed, but not succeeding very well. Even in the fading light, he could see they were armed and moved with the careful coordination of men accustomed to dangerous work. "Caroline," he said quietly, his eyes never leaving the horseman. "The floor." She didn't argue or ask questions. The locket disappeared under her shirt, and she was already at the hidden entrance to her hiding place before he'd finished speaking. "Remember what I taught you," he whispered as she lifted the trapdoor. "No matter what you hear, you don't come out until I come and get you." "I remember." She slipped into the dark space beneath the floorboards, and Ely carefully replaced the planking. To anyone who didn't know it was there, it looked like a solid floor. Outside, the riders had stopped at the edge of the clearing. They were speaking in voices too low to make out the words, but their posture suggested they were planning their approach. Eli checked his weapons, the Colt on his hip, the Sharp's rifle leaning near the door, and the old cavalry saber he'd kept from the war. Then he sat in a chair near the window, where he could see the entire clearing, and waited. If these were the men who were after Caroline, they were about to find out that some mountains have teeth. The horseman approached slowly, dismounting at the edge of the clearing where the forest met Ailey's small garden. Through the crack in the shutters, he could see them more clearly now. 3 hard-faced men, dressed in the kind of clothes that could belong to anyone from traveling merchants to hired guns. But their movements betrayed a carefully controlled violence. The leader was a tall, lean man with graying hair and cold eyes that scanned the cabin with a professional appraisal. His companions flanked him naturally, their hands resting near their guns. These were not local troublemakers or desperate bandits. These men were hunters. "Hello, the house!" the leader called out, his voice carrying the easy authority of a man used to being obeyed. "We'd like a word." Ali remained silent, watching through the shutters. One of the other men, younger, with a scar that ran from his left ear to his collar, was studying the ground near the cabin with keen interest. "Fresh tracks," the scarred man said quietly. "Small ones. The girl's been here recently." Eli's blood ran cold, but he forced himself to remain perfectly still. Beneath the floorboards, Caroline would be hearing every word. He could only hope she remembered her training and stayed hidden no matter what. "We know you're in there," the leader continued. "We're federal marshals on official business. We need to search your property." Federal marshals. Either they were lying, or Caroline had been right about seeing a badge the night her family died. Either way, Eli wasn't about to let them in. "Show me your credentials," Eli called out, making sure his voice came from a different window than the one he was watching from. The leader reached into his coat and produced what looked like an official badge and some papers. But at this distance, in the uncertain light, Eli couldn't verify their authenticity. More importantly, legitimate marshals didn't typically conduct searches at dusk without the local law present. "We're investigating the murder of federal judge Robert Carlyle and his family," the leader called. "We have reason to believe you may have information relevant to our investigation." "I don't know anything about any judge," Eli answered. The third man, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. He was younger than the others, with the kind of face that suggested he enjoyed his work a little too much. "Funny," this man said, a note of amusement in his voice. "Sheriff Hartwell, down in Copper Falls, mentioned you seemed mighty interested in those wanted posters when you were in town last week." Eli cursed silently. Hartwell had been more observant than he'd given him credit for. "A man would have to be deaf not to hear talk like that," Eli called back. "Doesn't mean I know anything useful." The leader gestured to his companions, and they began to spread out, one moving toward the barn, the other toward the woodpile. They were flanking him, cutting off potential escape routes. Professional tactics. "Here's what we think happened," the leader continued, stepping closer to the cabin. "We think that little girl, Caroline Carlyle, somehow survived the attack on her family. We think she wandered in the mountains for a while before some good Samaritan found her and took her in." Ailey's finger moved to the trigger of his rifle. "Now, this good Samaritan probably thinks he's doing the right thing," the man went on, "protecting a scared little girl from more trauma. But what he doesn't understand is that this child is the key to our investigation. Without her testimony, the killers may never be brought to justice." The words were reasonable, even compassionate, but something in the man's tone, a slight emphasis on certain words, a coldness beneath the official courtesy, told Eli everything he needed to know. These were not lawmen seeking justice. These were the killers themselves. "Like I said," Eli replied, "I don't know anything about any girl." The scarred man had reached the barn and was examining the tracks around it more closely. Eli watched him kneel and run his fingers over the ground, reading the signs with the practiced skill of someone who hunted both animals and men. "Two sets of prints here," the man called out. "Man and child going from the cabin to the barn and back. Recent, maybe this morning." The leader smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Mr. Thorne, isn't it? That's what the sheriff called you. We're going to search your property now, If you cooperate, this will go smoothly for everyone involved. You have a warrant? We don't need a warrant when we're in pursuit of federal fugitives. That was a lie. Even federal marshals needed proper paperwork for searches, especially on private property. But these men weren't planning on following legal procedures. The youngest of the three had circled around behind the cabin and was now examining the small vegetable garden. Eli watched him kneel beside the rows of potatoes, studying something on the ground. More tracks here, the young man called out. Looks like someone's been teaching her how to walk quiet, army style. Eli gritted his teeth. Caroline's training had been rigorous, but she was still a 6-year-old child. Against experienced trackers, even the best education had its limits. You were a soldier, weren't you, Mr. Thorne? The leader asked. Colorado 5th Infantry, according to the sheriff. Saw action at Glorieta Pass. Lost your brother there. The casual mention of Tommy's death hit Eli like a physical blow. These men had done their research. They knew exactly who they were dealing with. The war's been over for 9 years, Eli said. But some lessons stick with a man. Like teaching a child military fieldcraft? The leader was close to the cabin now, maybe 20 feet from the door. The point is, Mr. Thorne, we know she's here. The only question is whether you're going to make this easy or hard. Eli made his decision. These men were not leaving without Caroline, and they weren't planning on taking her alive. The only chance she had was if he could eliminate the threat, right here and now. All right, he said, moving away from the window. You got me. She's here. He heard the leader give a satisfied chuckle. Now that's what I like to hear. Where is she? The cellar, Eli lied. She's hiding in the root cellar. The doors are around the back of the cabin. It was a calculated risk. The cellar he referred to was real, but it was empty. Just a storage space for vegetables and preserves. But it would draw at least 2 of them away from the cabin and give him better odds. Smart girl, the leader said. Barbie, Jake, you check the cellar. I'll keep our friend here company. The scarred man and the younger one moved toward the back of the cabin, while the leader remained out front, his gun now openly in his hand. Eli watched through the shutters as they disappeared from view, then counted to 10. The assault came faster than he'd expected. The cabin door exploded inward, the leader kicking it with enough force to splinter the wooden bar. But Eli wasn't there. He had moved to a position beside the fireplace, using the stone chimney for cover. The rifle boomed once, its deep roar echoing through the small space like a crack of thunder. The leader spun and fell, clutching a ruined shoulder, but he was still alive. Eli was already moving, drawing his Colt as shouts erupted from behind the cabin. He's not in the cellar, one of the men yelled. It's empty! Heavy footsteps pounded around the side of the cabin as the other 2 converged on the front door. Eli pressed himself against the wall beside the entrance, listening to them approach. The military tactics from the war flooded back into his mind. Fields of fire, cover, and concealment. The deadly mathematics of close-quarters combat. The scarred man appeared in the doorway first, silhouetted against the dying daylight. Eli's Colt barked twice, and the man crumpled to the ground. But the third attacker was right behind him, firing rapidly with a repeater shotgun that tore splinters from the doorframe and the walls. Eli dove behind the overturned table as buckshot hissed through the space where he'd been standing. The wounded leader was trying to crawl toward his dropped weapon, leaving a smear of blood on the rough-hewn floorboards. Give us the girl, and we'll end this quick, the remaining attacker shouted from outside. Eli didn't waste time with a reply. Instead, he snatched the old cavalry saber from the wall, a weapon that had served him well at Glorieta Pass. when ammunition ran low and the fighting turned desperate. The third man burst through the doorway with his shotgun raised, but he was expecting to face another gun, not 18 inches of sharpened steel. The saber took him in the chest before he could adjust his aim, and he fell onto the blade with an expression of pained surprise. Silence settled over the cabin like dust after an explosion. Eli stood among the bodies of the three men who had come to kill a 6-year-old child and felt no remorse. The war had taught him many things, but perhaps the most important was that some people choose to be monsters, and monsters have to be stopped. "Caroline," he called out softly. "It's over. You can come out now." A hidden section of the floor lifted, and her pale form appeared in the opening. She climbed slowly out of the root cellar, her eyes taking in the carnage without flinching. "Are they dead?" she asked. "Two of them are. The third is hurt bad, but he's breathing." Carolyn walked to the wounded leader, who watched her with eyes full of hatred and recognition. She looked down at him for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice held no fear. "You killed my family." The man's lips twisted into what might have been a smile. "Should have killed you too, girl. Would have saved everyone a lot of trouble." Carolyn turned back to Eli. "We can't stay here anymore, can we?" "No," he said gently. "We can't. Are you ready to go find what your father hid?" She nodded, her small hand moving to touch the locket beneath her shirt. "I'm ready." As they gathered their belongings, preparing to leave the only home they had shared, Eli felt the weight of what was to come. The coordinates in Carolyn's locket would lead them into unknown territory, hunted by men who would stop at nothing to silence the only witness to a federal judge's murder. But they had something their enemies didn't. They had each other. And sometimes, that was enough to change the world. They left the cabin in the pre-dawn darkness, the mountain shrouded in a mist that would hide their tracks for the first few miles. Carolyn rode behind Eli on Jasper, her arms wrapped around his waist, the weight of her small body a constant reminder of the stakes. The wounded man had died during the night. Eli had checked before they left, but his death wouldn't buy them much time. When these three failed to report back, others would come looking. They followed deer trails and old mining paths, avoiding the main routes that would expose them to other travelers. Eli had packed light but efficiently, a week's worth of food, ammunition, medical supplies, and the few personal items they couldn't leave behind. Caroline's wooden horse was in her pocket, beside the mysterious drawing, while the silver locket swayed gently against her chest with each of Jasper's steps. By noon, they were in territory Eli had never explored, guided only by his compass and the coordinates etched into Caroline's locket. The landscape grew more rugged as they climbed, the pine forests giving way to exposed rock and thin air that made Jasper labor with every mile. "Tell me about your mother," Eli said during one of their rest stops. They sat in the shadow of a large boulder while Jasper grazed on the sparse grass nearby. Caroline was silent for so long, he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft with memory. She smelled like roses. She had a perfume Papa brought her from Denver, and she'd put a little bit behind her ears every morning. Caroline took the drawing from her pocket, unfolding it carefully. "She taught me how to draw. She said art was important because it helped people remember beautiful things, even when times were hard." She sounds like a wise woman. She was. Caroline studied the crude sketch of the house and the tree. "His drawing. I remember making it. Mama was helping me. guiding my hand to make the lines straight. But it was Papa who told me what to draw. Do you remember anything else about that day? Carolyn closed her eyes, concentrating. There were men coming to the house. Papa told me to go upstairs and get my drawing things while he talked to Mama. They were scared, I could tell. And Papa kept saying something about insurance and making sure the truth survived. Eli felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Insurance. A failsafe in case something happened to him. That's what I think too. Caroline folded the drawing and put it away. Papa was always careful about everything. Mama used to tease him for keeping 3 different sets of keys to the house just in case. They rode on through the afternoon, climbing steadily toward the coordinates that would either solve the mystery of Judge Carlisle's hidden evidence or lead them into another trap. The terrain grew more difficult, forcing them to dismount and lead Jasper through narrow passages between towering rocks. By nightfall, they made camp in a sheltered hollow, surrounded by stunted pines. Eli built a small fire with dry wood that would produce minimal smoke, while Caroline gathered water from a nearby creek. Their domestic routine had adapted to the trail with surprising ease, each of them taking on tasks without being asked. Eli, Carolyn said, as they shared a simple meal of jerky and hardtack. What happens if we find what Papa hid, but it isn't enough to stop those men? It was the question he'd been avoiding all day. What do you mean? I mean, what if there are too many of them? What if they're too powerful? What if nobody believes us, even with Papa's proof? Eli studied her face in the firelight. For all she had been through, she still looked like a small, vulnerable child in her oversized clothes. But her questions showed a mind grappling with adult realities that would challenge people 3 times her age. Then we keep trying, he said at last. We find someone who will listen, someone who can't be bought or threatened. And if that doesn't work, we find another way. And if there is no other way? Eli was quiet for a moment, thinking of his own past, of the choices men made when faced with impossible odds. During the war, I knew soldiers who fought battles they couldn't win, because it was the right thing to do. Some of them died, but their sacrifice meant something. It inspired others to keep fighting. Like your papa. He knew that exposing the corruption might get him killed, but he did it anyway, because someone had to stand up for what was right. Caroline nodded thoughtfully, then pulled something else from her pocket. It wasn't the drawing or the locket, but a small piece of folded paper Eli had never seen before. I found this too, she said, handing it to him. It was sewn into the lining of my dress. Eli unfolded the paper carefully. Unlike the childish drawing, this was covered in a neat, adult hand. Caroline, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are in danger. The coordinates will lead you to the proof of what Morrison and his men have done. But be careful who you trust. The corruption runs deeper than we thought. Remember, the angel protects those who seek justice, but only the pure of heart can find her sanctuary. Your loving father. Morrison, Eli said, reading the name again. That's the same name as the shopkeeper in Copper Falls, Caroline finished for him. James Morrison. Eli felt the world shift around him. The friendly shopkeeper who had sold him supplies for 3 years, who made small talk about the weather and asked after his health, was somehow tied to the conspiracy that had killed Caroline's family. Could it be a coincidence? He said. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew it wasn't true. No, Caroline said softly. My father was too careful for coincidences. If he wrote Morrison's name, it's because Morrison is a part of this. Eli thought back to his last visit to the store, remembering how Morrison had seemed unusually interested in his reaction to the wanted poster. How the man had stressed certain details about the reward and the search for Caroline. Then, Sheriff Hartwell showing up so conveniently, asking pointed questions about strangers on the mountain. They were watching me, he realized. Morrison was reporting back to them about my visits, my reactions. That's how they knew to look for you at my cabin. Caroline pulled her knees to her chest, suddenly looking very young and very frightened. How many of them are there? How far does this go? I don't know, sweetheart. But your father's note gives us hope. He says he found proof. Whatever he hid at those coordinates, it might be enough to expose all of them. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind sighing through the pines and the distant call of a night bird. Finally, Caroline spoke again. Eli, are you scared? He thought about lying, offering some false comfort. But Caroline deserved the truth. Yes, he said. I'm scared. Not of dying. I've faced that before. But I'm scared of failing you, of letting something happen to you because I'm not good enough, or smart enough, or strong enough to protect you. Caroline was quiet for a moment. Then she scooted closer, settling against his side the way she had during those quiet evenings by the fire. My papa used to say that David beat Goliath, not because he was stronger, but because he was fighting for something more important than his own life. What was David fighting for? For his people, for his faith, for the belief that what was right was stronger than what was powerful. She looked up at him with those serious brown eyes. We're fighting for the same thing, aren't we? For justice, for my family, and for all the other people those men might hurt. Eli put his arm around her small shoulders, feeling the fierce resolve that radiated from her despite her size. Yes, he said, we are. Then we'll find a way. David didn't have a sword or armor, but he had something Goliath didn't. What was that? Carolyn smiled, the first genuinely happy expression he'd seen on her face since they'd left the cabin. He had God on his side, and we have each other. As they settled down to sleep, Eli doused the fire and checked their surroundings one last time. The next day, they would reach the coordinates, and whatever Judge Carlyle had hidden would either give them the weapon they needed to fight a war, or it would lead them into greater danger than either of them could imagine. But tonight, with Carolyn sleeping peacefully beside him under a canopy of stars, Eli felt something he hadn't experienced since the war. He felt part of something larger than himself, something worth the risk. In the distance, a wolf howled, not a threat, but a reminder that they were entering a wilder country, where survival depended on courage, cunning, and the bonds between those who chose to travel through the darkness together. They reached the coordinates at high noon, when the sun was directly overhead, casting short shadows on the rocky ground. At first glance, the location was unremarkable. A small basin nestled between two ridges, with a few stunted trees and a seasonal creek bed that trickled with snowmelt from the higher peaks. But as they studied the terrain more closely, Caroline's drawing began to make sense. There, she said, pointing to a lone pine tree that stood taller than the others near the creek bed. That's the tree from my drawing. Eli studied the pine. It was old, its trunk thick and gnarled, its branches spread like protective arms. But what caught his eye was the peculiar rock formation just behind it, a natural arrangement of boulders that, from the right angle, looked almost like a figure with outstretched wings. Under the angel's wing, he murmured, remembering the inscription on the locket. They dismounted and approached the tree with caution. The war had taught Eli never to trust ground that seemed too convenient, too perfect for an ambush. But the basin remained silent, save for the sound of running water and the whisper of wind through the pine needles. Caroline walked straight to the base of the tree, running her hands over the bark, as if searching for something specific. "Papa taught me about trees," she said. "How they grow, how they heal when they're hurt, how they keep secrets in their rings." She stopped at a section where the bark felt different, smoother, as if it had grown over something inserted into the trunk years ago. "Here," she said, "there's something here." Eli drew his knife and began to work carefully at the bark. It peeled away, revealing a small metal tube, no bigger than his thumb, that had been driven into the tree and sealed with pine resin. The tree had grown around it over the years, hiding it completely. Inside the tube was a tightly rolled piece of oilcloth, and within it, several folded documents on letterhead paper. Eli spread them carefully on a flat rock, Caroline watching with rapt attention. The first document was a letter addressed to whomever may find this record of my investigation into territorial corruption. It was signed by Judge Robert Carlyle and dated 3 months before his death. But it was the contents that made Eli's blood run cold. "Caroline," he said softly, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. What I'm about to read will change everything we thought we knew about your father's murder." She nodded, clutching the wooden horse. Eli began to read aloud. "To whomever may discover this evidence, my name is Robert Carlyle, Federal District Judge for the Colorado Territory. For the past 2 years, I have been investigating a conspiracy involving the systematic theft of federal funds intended for territorial development, road construction, and Indian affairs. The conspiracy involves everyone from local merchants to territorial officials and members of the United States Congress." Caroline's eyes widened, but she remained silent. Eli continued, "My investigation has revealed that the conspiracy is far more complex than simple theft. The stolen funds are being used to purchase arms and supplies for a private militia, whose ultimate goal is to provoke a war with the Southern Ute tribe, thereby justifying the seizure of tribal lands known to contain significant mineral deposits." Eli paused, letting the implications sink in. "The ringleaders of this conspiracy include Territorial Governor Samuel Morrison." "Morrison," Caroline whispered. "Caroline Huemon," as well as the storekeeper, his brother, James Morrison, who operates a supply network across the territory, Federal Marshal William Garrett, and Congressman Franklin Pierce of Massachusetts, who has been instrumental in securing the diverted funds. Eli set the letter down, his mind racing. "Caroline, your father wasn't killed by corrupt local officials. He was killed by men planning to start a war." The second document was even more damning. A detailed ledger showing the flow of federal money from Washington through various intermediaries to the Morrison brothers' operation, purchases of weapons, supplies for militia training, bribes to local officials. It was all documented in Judge Carlyle's meticulous handwriting. But it was the third document that revealed the full extent of the horror they faced. It was a blood-stained, partially torn letter, clearly taken from another person. The letterhead read United States Marshal's Service, and it was addressed to Marshal Garrett. Caroline leaned closer as Eli read. "William, the judge is getting too close. His investigation has uncovered the weapons shipments and the militia training sites. We need to eliminate him and his family before he can present his findings to the territorial legislature." Make it look like an Indian raid or outlaws. The girl cannot survive. She was in his office when he worked on the investigation and may have seen documents. No witnesses. Have the job done by the end of the month, or the entire operation is compromised. The letter was signed with initials that made Eli's stomach clench. S.M. Samuel Morrison, the territorial governor himself. They didn't just kill your family because of what your father found, Eli said quietly. They killed your family because he was about to expose a plan to slaughter innocent people and steal their land. Caroline stared at the blood-stained letter, her face pale but resolute. How many people will die if we don't stop them? Hundreds, maybe thousands. If they manage to start a war with the Ute, it won't just be the tribespeople who suffer. Every settler, every family in the territory will be caught in the middle. But even as the full horror of the conspiracy became clear, Eli realized they faced an almost impossible challenge. Governor Morrison controlled the territorial government. Marshal Garrett controlled federal law enforcement in the region. Congressman Pierce held sway in Washington. How could one mountain man and a little girl hope to expose a corruption that stretched from Colorado all the way to the nation's capital? There's more, Carolyn said, pointing to a fourth document Eli hadn't noticed. This one was different. It wasn't a letter or a ledger, but a map, showing locations across the territory marked with symbols. Some spots were marked with crossed rifles, others with dollar signs, and still others with what looked like headstones. Training camps, Eli realized, studying the rifle symbols. Supply caches, he added, looking at the dollar signs. And these? He pointed to the headstones, a growing horror in his voice. Caroline's voice was almost a whisper. What are they? Massacre sites? Places where they plan to attack Ute villages and make it look like the tribe struck first. Eli counted the headstones, 7 sites, representing hundreds of innocent lives. The final document was a timeline written in code, but with references clear enough to make its meaning unmistakable. The first incident was scheduled for less than 2 weeks from now, timed to coincide with a peaceful gathering of Ute families at their traditional summer grounds. We have to stop them, Caroline said, her voice stronger now, despite the tears on her cheeks. We have to warn the Ute people and expose the conspiracy. Eli looked at the documents spread before him. Evidence that could bring down governments and save lives, but only if they could get it to the right people. The problem was figuring out who could be trusted when the rot went so high. Your father was smart, he said, carefully folding the papers. He knew this proof would mean nothing without a way to get it to honest officials. He must have had a plan. Caroline was silent for a moment, then took out the silver locket and opened it again. Look closer at the engraving, she said. Not just the coordinates, but everything else. He examined the inside of the locket in the bright mountain sunlight. Along the rim, almost too small to read, was another line of text he hadn't seen before. Denver Post. Tom Wilson, editor, trusted. Tom Wilson? Eli said. A newspaper editor in Denver. Not just any editor, Caroline said, her excitement growing. Papa talked about him before. He's the one who's been writing articles about the territorial corruption. Papa said he's one of the few honest men left in government. Eli felt a flicker of hope for the first time since they'd left the cabin. A newspaper editor would have the resources to publish the evidence and the connections to ensure it reached federal authorities who couldn't be bought by the territorial officials. Denver is a 4-day ride from here, he said, through some of the most dangerous country in the territory. More dangerous than staying here and letting those men commit a massacre? She was right, of course. They had a moral obligation that transcended their own safety. The evidence they carried could stop a war and save countless lives. But as they prepared to leave the valley, Eli spotted a dust cloud on the horizon. Riders approaching fast. Someone had followed them to the coordinates, and from the speed at which they were closing, it was not a friendly visit. "Caroline," he said urgently, "we have to go, now." As they mounted Jasper and spurred him toward the narrow trail leading north toward Denver, Eli realized their true journey was just beginning. They were no longer simply trying to survive or find justice for Caroline's family. They were in a race against time to stop a catastrophe that would reshape the American West. Behind them, the riders were closing in, and ahead lay 4 days of treacherous travel through territory controlled by the very men who wanted them dead. But they had something their enemies didn't: the truth. And sometimes, if you were brave enough, lucky enough, and determined enough, the truth was more powerful than all the guns, corruption, and government connections in the world. The question was whether they could stay alive long enough to prove it. The chase began in earnest as they left the valley, with at least 6 riders visible on the ridgeline behind them. Eli pushed Jasper hard across terrain that favored their pursuers: open country, where their single mule was far outmatched by horses bred for speed and endurance. But what they lacked in speed, Eli made up for with his intimate knowledge of mountain travel and the desperate ingenuity of a man protecting his child. They rode through the afternoon and into the dusk, stopping only when Jasper's ragged breathing made it clear the animal needed rest. During the brief stop beside a mountain stream, Carolyn helped Eli check their most precious cargo. Judge Carlisle's documents were now wrapped in the oilcloth and secured in his saddlebags, alongside his own most prized possession from the war. "Why did you bring that?" Caroline asked, watching him carefully clean and oil the Confederate officer's sword that had served him at Glorieta Pass. "Because sometimes the old ways are the best," Eli said, testing the blade's edge against his thumb. "Your father's proof will save a lot of lives, but only if we can get it to Tom Wilson in Denver. Those men chasing us will do anything to stop that from happening." Caroline studied his weathered face in the fading light. "Do you think we'll have to fight them?" "I think they won't give us a choice," Eli answered, sheathing the sword and strapping it to his saddle. "But that's not what I'm worried about." "What are you worried about?" Eli was silent for a moment, listening to the distant sound of hooves echoing off the canyon walls. Their pursuers were closer than he'd hoped, and night was falling fast. "I'm worried about time," he said finally. "According to your father's timeline, the first attack on the Ute village is set to happen in 11 days. Even if we make it to Denver, even if Tom Wilson believes us and publishes the story, it might not be enough to stop what's already in motion." Caroline took the wooden horse from her pocket, turning it over in her small hands, as she did when she was thinking hard about something. "Papa always said that doing the right thing was more important than doing the easy thing." "That's true." "And he said that sometimes, one person standing up for what's right can change everything." Eli managed to smile, despite the desperate circumstances. "That's true, too." "Then let's keep going," she said. "Let's get Papa's proof to Denver and trust that the truth is stronger than their lies." They mounted up again as full darkness settled over the mountains, using the cover of night to put more distance between themselves and their pursuers. But traveling by moonlight was treacherous, and when Jasper stumbled on a loose rock and nearly threw them both, Eli made the difficult decision to make camp. They found shelter in a shallow cave, really just an overhang on the rock face, where Eli could build a small fire that wouldn't be visible from the valley below. As Carolyn curled up in the blankets with the wooden horse clutched to her chest, Eli sat at the mouth of the cave and tried to plan their next move. The direct route to Denver would take them through Copper Falls, but that was obviously impossible now. Morrison would have men watching every approach to the town. The longer mountain route would add 2 days to their journey, time they couldn't afford to lose if they wanted to stop the massacre. But there was a third option, one that carried enormous risk but might give them the edge they needed. The old mining road through Devil's Canyon was treacherous and all but abandoned, but it would shave a day off their travel time and bypass the areas where Morrison's men would expect them to go. Devil's Canyon had earned its name. The road was little more than a ledge blasted into the canyon wall, with a sheer drop of several hundred feet on one side and unstable rock on the other. In winter, avalanches made it completely impassable. Even in summer, rock slides and flash floods claimed the lives of experienced miners who tried to use the shortcut. But it was also the last place their enemies would ever expect them to go. "Caroline," he said softly, shaking her gently awake, "I need to talk to you about tomorrow." She sat up at once, wide awake, in a way that spoke to how much had already been demanded of her young life. "What is it?" Eli explained about Devil's Canyon, about the risks and the potential reward. He told her honestly that it might be their only chance to get to Denver in time, but it could also be the place where they both died. Caroline listened without interrupting, her brown eyes serious in the firelight. When he finished, she was silent for a long moment. "If we don't make it," she said at last, "those Ute families will die, and their children will never get to grow up and have families of their own." "That's true. But if we don't cross the canyon," Eli said, the words heavy with the truth they both knew, "we may not reach Denver in time to save them." "That's also true." Caroline's nod was decisive, her young face set with a resolve that belied her years. "So we crossed the canyon." Eli felt a swell of pride in her courage, a feeling immediately soured by the gut-wrenching fear of what he was asking her to do. "It's going to be dangerous, sweetheart. More dangerous than anything we've faced yet." "I know." She reached into her pocket, but her hand emerged, not with the familiar wooden horse, but with something else. A small piece of carved stone he had never seen before. "Papa gave me this. Before that night. He said it was a guardian stone to protect me when he couldn't." She held it up to the firelight, and Eli could see it was carved in the shape of an angel, its wings spread in a protective embrace. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the kind of artistry that spoke of deep love and painstaking attention. "He made this for you," Eli said, his voice soft. "He told me angels watch over people trying to do good in the world," she whispered. "That even when things feel hopeless, even when we're scared, we're never truly alone." Eli thought of his own guardian angels. Tommy, who had died saving a friend. Judge Carlyle, who had risked everything to expose a rot he could no longer abide. And Caroline herself, who had walked into his life and given him a reason to care about something beyond his own survival. "Then we'll trust in the angels," he said, meeting her gaze. "And we'll trust in each other." They spent the remaining hours before dawn in final preparations. Eli redistributed their supplies, keeping only the bare essentials and caching the rest in the cave for a later, more hopeful time. He checked and rechecked his weapons, the metallic click of him cleaning his rifle the only sound in the pre-dawn quiet. Carolyn helped with a silent efficiency, her small hands steady as she rolled their bedrolls and secured the water supplies. But Eli noticed she was moving differently, not with the resigned acceptance of a child following an adult's lead, but with the purposeful determination of a partner preparing for a shared mission. "Caroline," he said, as they stood at the mouth of the cave, ready to leave, "I need you to promise me something." "What?" "If something happens to me in that canyon, if I fall, get hurt, or worse, I need you to promise you'll keep going. You take Jasper and the documents, and you get to Denver, no matter what." Her chin set in a stubborn line he was coming to know well. "Nothing's going to happen to you. Promise me anyway." "No." The flat refusal startled him. "No," she repeated, her voice ringing with unshakable conviction, echoing his own words from what felt like a lifetime ago. "We're family now. Family doesn't leave family behind. If something happens to you, I'll try to help you. If something happens to me, you'll try to help me. That's what family does." Eli looked down at this small, fierce girl who had somehow become the center of his world, and he knew she was right. They were family in the truest sense, bound not by blood, but by choice, by shared sacrifice, by the kind of love that makes people willing to face impossible odds for one another. "All right," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We stick together, no matter what." They stepped out of the cave into the gray light of dawn, the mountain air crisp with the promise of another hot day. Behind them, somewhere on their trail, armed men followed with orders to kill them. Ahead lay Devil's Canyon, a place where one false step meant death, and where their enemies could be lying in wait. But between those dangers lay their only real chance. Sometimes, when the stakes were high enough, the cause just enough, impossible odds were just another obstacle to overcome. As they mounted Jasper and turned toward the narrow trail, Eli felt the weight of his brother's sword against his leg, and the warmth of Carolyn's small body pressed against his back. Whatever the day brought, they would face it together. The old mountain man, the recluse who had fled from the world, was gone. In his place was a father who would move heaven and earth to protect his daughter, and to honor the sacrifice of those who died for justice. And if that meant riding through the gates of hell itself, then hell had better be ready. Devil's Canyon lived up to its reputation from the moment they entered the narrow passage. The old mining track clung to the cliff face like a jagged scar. It was barely wide enough for Jasper's hooves, crumbling at the edges where years of weather had gnawed away at the stone. To their left, the canyon wall rose almost vertically. To their right, sheer emptiness dropped into a darkness so complete that a tossed stone made no sound when it landed. Eli kept Jasper at a steady, deliberate pace. The mule's mountain-bred instincts served them well, the animal seeming to sense which parts of the ledge were solid and which were treacherous. Caroline rode silently behind him, but he could feel the tension in her small frame. Her arms were wrapped tightly around his waist, and in her right hand, she clutched the angel stone her father had given her. The wooden horse remained in her pocket, but the guardian angel was kept out, a totem against the dangers that surrounded them. They had been in the canyon for less than an hour when Eli heard the sound he had been dreading, the faint metallic clatter of hooves reverberating through the rock. Their pursuers had found the trail. "How many?" Caroline whispered. Eli listened, trying to pick apart the individual sounds from the echoing chaos. 4, maybe 5. They're moving faster than they should be on this terrain. Will they catch us? He thought about lying, offering a hollow comfort. But she had earned the truth. Probably. But catching us and stopping us are two different things. They pushed on, the sound of their pursuers growing steadily closer. It was Caroline who spotted the ambush. Eli, she said, her voice an urgent hiss against the wind that howled through the pass. Up ahead, on the ledge above us. He followed her gaze and saw them. Two men, positioned on a wider section of the track, some 400 yards ahead, their rifles already shouldering to take aim. They had somehow gotten ahead of them. They're trying to box us in, he realized. Men behind, men in front, and no way off the narrow ledge but down. Caroline, however, was studying the cliff face above them. Eli, look. That patch where the rock is lighter. Does that look like the mouth of a cave to you? He followed her pointing finger. 30 feet up the sheer rock face, a dark shadow suggested a horizontal cleft. It was nearly invisible, and reaching it would require a climber's skill. It's too high, he said. Too dangerous. Not for me. Before he could stop her, Caroline had slid off Jasper's back and was examining the rock face. Papa taught me to climb. I can make it up there. Absolutely not. Listen, she said, her urgency growing with the approaching hoofbeats. I'm small, I'm light. I can get up there with Papa's documents and hide them. Even if they catch us, the proof will survive. He wanted to refuse, to find any other way, but the tactical reality was grim. They couldn't go forward, couldn't go back, and couldn't stay put. If you fall, he began. I won't fall. She was already pulling the climbing rope from their supplies. But if I do, you keep going. You get to Denver and you tell Tom Wilson everything. He realized she was using his own words against him, demanding the same impossible promise. Caroline, promise me. The riders were close now, the sound of their approach a deafening echo. I promise, Eli said, hating every syllable. Caroline secured the documents in a waterproof satchel and slung it over her small shoulders. The angel stone went into her pocket beside the horse. Give me 5 minutes, she said. Then make a distraction. Make them think you're trying to fight your way through the ambush ahead. He watched her begin the ascent, her small fingers finding holds in the rock he could barely see. She moved with a startling confidence, testing each purchase before trusting it with her weight, moving steadily upward. The first shot cracked like thunder. Eli wheeled in the saddle to see their pursuers rounding the last bend. 4 men on horseback, their leader a face Eli recognized from a wanted poster. Marshal Garrett, the very man who had ordered the Carlyle's execution. End of the line, Thorne, Garrett bellowed, his voice carrying clearly in the thin air. Give us the girl, and maybe we'll let you live. Eli drew his Colt, but held his fire. Caroline needed more time. She's not here, he yelled back. Sent her away 2 days ago. We ain't stupid, a voice shouted from the ambush ahead. We can see her climbing the rock face. Eli's heart sank. Of course they could. Against the pale stone, her small figure was a clear target. More shots erupted, from behind and in front, bullets whining off the rocks around them. Jasper reared in terror, hooves scrabbling on the narrow ledge. Eli fought to control the mule while returning fire, but they were hopelessly exposed. Above them, Caroline was nearly at the cave, but her climb had slowed. He could see she was tiring. Get down from there, girl, Garrett roared. Come on down and we'll make this quick. Caroline didn't answer, but Eli saw her press herself flat against the rock, momentarily frozen. It was then he made the decision. He couldn't fight them all and protect her at the same time, but he could buy her the time she needed. With a wordless roar that was part fury and part prayer, Eli drove his heels into Jasper's flanks, charging directly toward the ambush ahead. He held the reins in his left hand. In his right, his brother's Confederate cavalry sword gleamed in the harsh sunlight. It was a desperate, suicidal charge, but it served its purpose. Every gun, every eye turned to him. In that crucial moment, no one was watching the small girl who finally pulled herself over the lip of the cave entrance and vanished into the darkness, carrying with her the proof that could save hundreds of lives. As Eli closed the distance, the improvised explosives he had prepared, mining charges of black powder and metal shards, detonated among the ambush with devastating effect. The canyon's narrow confines funneled the explosions, turning them into concentrated weapons that scattered men and horses. But even as his desperate gambit succeeded, Eli felt the searing impact of a rifle bullet in his shoulder, then another in his leg. His horse, Jasper, stumbled and fell, throwing his rider with brutal force against the unforgiving stone of the canyon wall. As consciousness faded, Eli's last clear thought was a prayer that Caroline would remember everything he had taught her about survival, because now she was truly on her own. Caroline pressed herself against the back wall of the cave, listening to the echoes of gunfire and screams rising from the chasm below. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she clutched the canvas satchel holding her father's documents. The proof that could prevent a massacre, if only she could get it to Denver. The cave was smaller than it had appeared from below. There was barely enough room for her to crouch, but it stretched deeper into the rock.